Hello and welcome to another EDH gameplay video brought to you by MTG Mudster.
Errated to have affinity for generic goblin noises.
Hey gang, just to let you know, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com and originalmagicart.store. Using the code gets you 10% off orders $10 or more, and you get to help out the channel at the same time. Today's game is sadly the last one I was able to film at GP/MagicFest New Jersey. We have longtime viewer Chris playing his Selvala deck, and he keeps Beastcaller Savant, Dose in the Falling Leaf, Heroic Intervention, Soul of the Harvest, Heritage Druid, and a Plains. We've got the brothers Joe and Rob back, with Rob playing his Mathas deck, keeping 2 Plains, Mesa Enchantress, Smoldering Marsh, Captive Audience, Twilight Prophet, and Bojuka Bog. Joe is playing Olivia, keeping Sulphurous Springs, Evolving Wilds, Dusk Legion Zealot, Tilonelli's Skinshifter, Commander Sphere, Swamp, and Phyrexian Reclamation. Lastly, we've got the mad scientist Harry playing Garna, keeping a Plaguecrafter, Priest of Gix, Perilous Mirror, Command Tower, Solemn Simulacrum, Anti's Hovel, and a Commander Sphere as well. Rob wins the die roll, and he starts us off. Rob plays a Smoldering Marsh, which comes in tapped, and he passes. Chris is very lucky as he draws a Temple Garden off the top and plays it, taking 2. He then casts Heritage Druid and passes. Joe plays an Evolving Wilds and cracks it. Harry plays a tapped Auntie's Hovel with no goblin to reveal and passes. Rob plays a Bojuka Bog and exiles Joe's Evolving Wilds. Chris plays a Plains and casts his Beastcaller Savant, passing to Joe. Joe plays a Swamp, and we see a Dusk Legion Zealot hit the field. The Enter the Battlefield trigger then happens, and Joe loses 1 life and draws a card. Harry plays a Swamp and casts Perilous Mirror. Rob plays a Plains and brings out Mathas. At the end of turn, he puts a bounty counter on the mirror Harry had just cast, and he passes to Chris. Chris casts Llanowar Elves in his main phase, and tapping 3 elves to his Heritage Druid's ability makes 3 green mana, which is enough to pay for Elvish Archdruid, before he passes to Joe. Joe plays a Swamp and brings out Olivia, passing to Harry. Harry plays a Command Tower and swings the Perilous Mirror at Rob. Rob blocks, and with the mirror dying, 2 triggers go in the stack. The first has Harry dealing 2 damage to the Elvish Archdruid, and the second has all of Harry's opponents gaining 2 life and drawing a card from Mathas' trigger for when a creature with a bounty counter dies. Harry then casts a Rakdos Key Ruin and passes. Rob plays a Plains and casts Mesa Enchantress. He then moves to his end step, putting a bounty counter on Chris's Heritage Druid. Chris casts Aquarian Ranger in his main phase and taps 3 elves once more for 3 green mana. He uses it to cast Growing Rites of Itlimoc and reveals an Elvish Mystic from the 4 cards that he got to look at. At the end of turn, the Growing Rites flips to reveal Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun. Joe plays a Sulphurous Springs and taps out to drop a Shimmyan Spectre. He discards a Commander Sphere to Livy's ability, giving the Spectre a +1/+1 counter and haste. He swings the Spectre at Chris for 3, hitting him and getting to choose a non-land card from Chris's hand, which in this case is Chris's Soul of the Harvest. Joe then also gets to go through Chris's library as part of the trigger to get a feel for what Chris's deck is like. Harry casts a Solemn Simulacrum in his main phase to find a basic, and Rob decides to cast Vampiric Tutor, taking 2 to tutor for a card and put it on top. Rob draws the card he tutored for, and he casts a Curse of Opulence on Chris. We then see Read the Bones, leaving both the cards on top, and Rob draws 2 and loses 2 life. Moving to combat, Rob swings the Mesa Enchantress at Chris, dealing no damage, but gaining a gold token from the curse trigger. At the end of turn, Rob puts a bounty counter on the Solemn Simulacrum. Chris untaps and draws for turn. He then taps the Itlimoc for 4 green mana, and he drops Dosen and an Elvish Mystic with the mana. He then taps the Savant and Llanowar Elves to pay for Daiwin's Elite, getting a token as the Elite enters, and Chris then passes. Joe casts the Tanalnali Skinshifter in his main phase and discards a card to give it a +1/+1 counter and haste. He swings the Spectre at Chris once more and the Skinshifter at Harry, who becomes a copy of the Spectre on attack. Rob and Joe then gain a gold token, and Harry and Chris then take 3, and Joe gets to exile a card from each of their hands. Chris only has 1 card in hand and has to exile the Heroic Intervention, while Joe picks Plaguecrafter from Harry's. Before passing, Joe then sacrifices his newly made gold tokens to help pay for Terminate and takes out Dosen. Harry casts Phyrexian Altar in his main phase and sacrifices the Solemn, gaining 1 mana and drawing a card, while giving his opponents 2 life, and also drawing them a card from the bounty counter. Harry then drops a reassembling skeleton, sacrificing it to the altar as well, and taps the rest of his mana to pay for Grim Haruspex. Rob plays a command tower, and swings the Mesa Enchantress at Chris again, who decides not to block provided Rob doesn't keep dumping on him. Rob agrees and gains a gold token. In Rob's second main phase, he casts Captive Audience on Harry and draws a card from the Enchantress as it enters the battlefield. Moving to his end of turn, Rob puts a bounty counter on Harry's Haruspex and passes to Chris. Chris plays a Forest and casts Selvala in his main phase. He then drops a Priest of Titania, and with no cards in hand, is now hellbent in elves. Joe swings the Spectre at Harry and the Skin Shifter at his brother, having it become a copy of the Spectre as well. He also swings the Dusk Legion Zealot at Chris to gain a gold token for he and his brother. Harry then exiles his only card in hand, the Priest of Gix, while Joe takes Rob's Test of Endurance. In his second main phase, Joe sacrifices his gold token to cast a Phyrexian Reclamation and passes to Harry. Harry chooses to discard his non-existent hand for the audience trigger on his upkeep and draws for turn. In his main phase, he brings back out the reassembling skeleton and sacrifices it to the altar to gain 1 black mana and draws a card as it dies. He then casts a Viscera Seer and does the skeleton cycle a few more times to get 2 more cards to his hand before passing to Rob. Rob draws for turn and casts Agent of Erebos, exiling Harry's graveyard as it comes in and drawing from the Mesa Enchantress. Rob then plays an untapped Godless Shrine, taking 2, and he casts a Twilight Prophet. He gains City's Blessing, and moving to his end step, puts a bounty counter on the Priest of Titania. Joe decides at this point that he wants to kill Selvala, and does so with sudden death. Chris draws and casts a Wirewood Symbiote, having basically assembled Legacy Elves. He bounces the Heritage Druid back to his hand because of the Wirewood Symbiote, and recasts it. He then recasts Selvala, and passes turn. Joe plays a Mountain, and casts Graveborn Muse, discarding a card to give it a counter and haste. Joe then swings both the Spectre and the Skin Shifter, having it become a copy of the Spectre at his brother. Rob blocks one of them with the Twilight Prophet, but still takes the hit and has to exile a card. This time, Joe exiles Revel in Riches from Rob's hand. Harry chooses to give his opponent zombies this time from the Captive Audience ability, and he casts Meteor Golem in his main phase to blow up the audience before it can set him to 4 life. He then plays a tapped Rakdos Guildgate and passes. Unfortunately, the first minute of Rob's turn is corrupted, but he reveals a Knight's Whisper from the Twilight Prophet trigger, dealing 2 to everyone and gaining 2. He then casts a Pestilence in his main phase, drawing from the Mesa Enchantress, and then activates it once to kill some elves. Rob then casts the Knight's Whisper to lose 2 life and draw 2 cards. He then activates the Pestilence 2 more times to kill the majority of the board, and all of Harry's opponents draw a card and gain 2 life as the Haruspex with a bounty counter on it dies. Chris plays a Bountiful Promenade as his land for turn, and casts Lightning Greaves. He then activates Selvala and hits 3 non-land cards, gaining 3 life and 3 green mana, and everyone draws a card. Chris then recasts the Priest of Titania, which he returned to his hand with the Wirewood Symbiote, and passes. Joe loses 1 and draws a card with the Graveborn Muse, and then plays a Dragonskull Summit. He casts a Flamewake Phoenix in his main phase as well, and he swings it at Chris for 2 damage, and he and his brother gain a gold token. In his second main phase, having met the spectacle requirements, Joe casts Light Up the Stage for only 1 red, and exiles 2 lands, passing to Harry. Harry draws for turn, and plays a Graven Cairns. We then see a Pitiless Plunderer from Harry's hand, and he then brings his pirate a friend by dropping Gonti. He uses Gonti's Enter the Battlefield trigger to target Rob, and keeps one of the top 4 cards. Harry then passes. Rob reveals a Dragonskull Summit off the top, and no one takes any damage or gains any life. Moving to combat, Rob swings the Prophet at Chris and gains another gold token and deals some damage. In his second main phase, Rob casts Torment of Hailfire where X is 7. Harry prevents 3 of the instances, taking only 12, while Joe and Chris take the full 21. Rob then casts Replenish once the torment has resolved, and brings back the Agent of Erebos, who exiles Harry's graveyard again, and the Captive Audience, who also goes back onto Harry once more. Chris draws and plays a Plains for turn. He then taps Selvala to parlay, and we see 2 non-land cards, giving Chris 2 green and 2 life. He then taps the Priest of Titania for 2 and a Forest to cast Privileged Position to help protect his creatures. At the end of turn, Joe activates Phyrexian Reclamation to take 2 life and pay 2 mana to bring back Olivia to his hand. Joe loses 1 in his upkeep to draw a card from the Muse trigger and then draws for turn. Joe plays one of the lands he exiled with Light Up the Stage, and he casts his own Twilight Prophet in his main phase, gaining City's Blessing as well, and passes to Harry. Harry discards his hand again to the captive audience trigger, and he draws and casts Soaring in his main phase. He sacrifices Gonti to the altar, gaining a treasure token from the pitiless plunderer. We then see Garna finally come out to play, and with Garna's own ability on the stack, Harry sacrifices her to the altar for 1 mana and gains another treasure token. He then gets to return Garna and Gonti back to his hand from the graveyard, and he sacrifices a treasure and taps a land to recast Gonti and targets Rob once more. Harry then sacrifices Gonti again, gaining a mana of his choice and a treasure token, and he then recasts Garna from his hand, sacrificing her again before her own trigger goes off and gains another mana and another treasure token, and then returns Gonti and Garna to hand. Using the floating mana and a treasure, Harry then casts Squee from exile. At the end of turn, Joe casts Complete Disregard to exile his brother's Twilight Prophet. Rob draws and goes to combat, swinging the Agent of Erebos at Chris and gaining a gold token from his curse. Rob then plays an Arcane Lighthouse for his land for turn, and he brings out Academy Rector. With the Rector on the stack, Chris uses his Beast Within to try and blow up Rob's Pestilence, but not before Rob is able to activate it 4 times, wiping the board of all the creatures and dealing 4 to each player. The Rector then resolves, and Rob passes to Chris. Chris draws and passes. Joe draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then recasts Olivia from his hand and passes to Harry. Harry has everyone make some zombies this time around, and Rob discards 2 cards from his hand to make 2 of them have a +1/+1 counter. Harry then casts one of the cards he'd exiled with Gonti, and for the first time since it's been printed, I see a Last One Standing hit the stack. They have someone pick a number at random between 1 and 17, and then roll a d20 to decide what creature is going to remain. They hit a 16, and only one of Joe's zombies gets to survive. With the Rector dying, Rob goes and grabs Luminarch's Ascension. Harry then recasts Gonti in his main phase, and he targets Chris this time around. Harry then passes, and Rob moves to cast Path to Exile on Gonti. Harry sacrifices Gonti rather than let him get exiled to the altar, and not wanting to let the mana go, he flashes in Garna. Rob is ready and uses Lapse of Certainty to put her on top of Harry's library, but Harry decides to put Garna to the command zone. Rob also gets to put a counter onto his Ascension at the end of turn. Rob casts Auramancer to bring back Pestilence to his hand. He then casts it and a Seal of Cleansing and passes to Chris. Chris casts an Elvish Visionary, drawing a card and playing a Forest. He puts the boots onto the Visionary and swings it at Joe, who blocks with the zombie. At the end of turn, Joe pays 2 mana and 2 life to bring Olivia back to his hand, and then does it again to bring back the Shimmy Spectre. At the end of turn, Rob also gets to put another counter onto his Ascension. Joe draws for turn and recasts Olivia. He then drops the Shimmy Spectre and discards Squee to Olivia's ability. He swings at his brother, but Rob is ready with the Swords to Plowshares. Joe then passes, and at the end of turn, Rob blows up Harry's altar, while Harry casts Chris's copy of Enlightened Tutor to go and find a card and put it on top of his library. He settles for an Altar of Dementia and starts his turn. Harry drops to 4 life from the captive audience choice and draws his altar for turn. The Altar of Dementia then hits the field, and Harry then casts Garna, and with her Enter the Battlefield trigger on the stack, sacrifices her to mill himself for 3 cards. Harry then returns Garna to his hand and passes, with Rob putting another counter onto his Ascension at the end of turn. Rob plays a Sacred Foundry, taking 2 life loss to have it come in untapped. He then casts a Smothering Tithe and moves to combat. The Auramancer goes at Chris for 2 and gives Rob a gold token, and with nothing else, he passes. Chris draws for turn and doesn't pay 2, so Rob gains a treasure token. Having gained said treasure token, Rob now has enough mana to take out the rest of the table with Pestilence and activates it 10 times to finish the guys off. Game review time. So, I think unfortunately Harry and Chris got picked on a little bit too much this game, and they really weren't able to contribute all that much to the game. Chris certainly seemed to be lacking any kind of draw engine, and by the time he did get one, he didn't really have a way to bounce it or recur it in any way. Harry's Garna deck certainly impressed me, and he had a lot of really fun interactions that I'd never really thought of. Sacrificing Garna to her own ability being on the stack, and then returning her to hand was a stroke of genius. I loved the play where he was able to get Gonti out several times in one turn, and it just goes to show, when Harry has a great idea, he's often able to build it into a sweet deck. I like Joe's Olivia deck, and the Simian Spectre was a fantastic addition, being able to pick key cards out of his opponent's hands. Unfortunately, I think he went after the 2 weakest links, and he probably should have focused more on his brother. He also took a lot of damage later in the game when he was at a precariously low life total, especially considering Pestilence was out on the field. Rob is always a big fan of making deals when it benefits him, but unfortunately I think this game no one should have taken him up on his offers. He was gaining a ton of gold tokens from his brother swinging at Chris, and considering everyone saw what was in his hand 2 or 3 times this game, I'm surprised that no one else focused him down. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/mtgmudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/mtgmudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.